So let's talk about some Space Marines and blasphemous spiky power armor, twisted Daemon Engines and mutant rabble, with a few thoughts as to the strengths and weaknesses of every single unit in Codex Chaos Space Marines. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos, and in this video I thought it could be good to look back in on the units of Codex Chaos Space Marines, go through each and every one, and talk through a few of their perks and drawbacks to putting them on the board versus their peers. I'll do a brief summary of each unit in the book, talking through a few of their perks and drawbacks, and starting with the infantry, then moving forward to tanks and vehicles, and then to characters. For each one I'll just give them a very rough and slightly arbitrary power score out of 10 as well, for roughly how I'd rate their strength in game. Loads to talk about for the Heretic Astartes though, so let's jump straight into it. First up, and starting with the standard troops, we have the Chaos Legionaries. They're an infantry unit that's 90 points for 5 of them and 170 per 10. Generally a pretty strong and efficient troops choice that make an appearance in lots of lists. They're OC2 to have some good weight on objectives, and they really have some pretty strong close range damage output for a more troop style unit. They can take a heavy weapon in the unit, either a las cannon or a Reaper chain cannon perhaps. 2 in a 5-man squad can take heavy melee weapons for a bunch of strength 8 and damage 2 punches, add a few chainswords on top of that, and then they get 2 inbuilt damage buffs with their dark packs, giving them either sustained or lethal hits, and also either reroll 1s to wound or reroll all wound rolls against targets on objective markers, so between all that they can put out some decent hurt. They most commonly tend to be fielded led by a Chaos Lord and jumping out of a Rhino. The Chaos Lord has massive amounts of melee damage output in himself, and really quite likes the rerolls that the squad can give him, as well as giving them his free stratagems. As the core troops with a good amount of damage, they've got plenty of synergies for basically all the detachments. They like doubling down on AP against objectives for Renegade Raiders. Any advance and charge things are quite nice for them, such as Slanesh Packbound, and general purpose melee brawler infantry generally do well in creations of Bile. They're quite a focal unit for the Deceptors as well, being one of the units that gets to infiltrate for them. For their main weaknesses, they're not really all that tough per points. At 18 points for a Space Marine body is merely fine, and lots of things kill that fast. And perhaps for their skirmishing on the front line style role, they'll be competing against other melee damage dealers like Chosen and Possessed. Still though, I rate them very strong for Chaos Space Marines. I've given them a 9 out of 10 here. Talking of Chosen though, they've got quite a similar battlefield role. They cost a fair bit more as the Chaos Elites for 125 points for 5 of them or 250 per 10. While not getting big inbuilt damage rerolls, they get good damage with their accursed weapons still. Lots of strength 5 AP-2 hits, plus a Power Fist and a paired set. Like the Legionaries, they get an icon for some rerolling dark pats, and they can chip in with a few pistol and combi weapon shots on top of that. They get inbuilt advance and charge, which is pretty nice for not needing command points to do that in certain detachments, and that gives them a very long threat range out of a Rhino. And like the regular Legionaries, they can be a good pairing with a Chaos Lord that can help handle tough stuff a bit better than they can, adding a bunch of high strength damage 3 attacks into the fray on his go turn. They're quite good for other leaders as well though. They could be a good one for Abaddon the Despoiler, liking his 4 rerolls to hit, which works better on them than the Terminators that already get it, and can be strong for Fabius Bile as well, with a big tanky profile with 3 wounds and some good general purpose melee. And they use both his augmentations well, plus the detachment rules from the creations of Bile. Again though, they've got good synergies with just about anything else that helps Chaos Space Marine melee damage, which is most of the detachments in their own way. Again, for weaknesses, like the Legionaries, they're not really overly tough per point. Special weapon fire will kill them quite fast despite having 3 wounds per body, and they do have less wounds than the Legionaries, and as mentioned, a few trade-offs between them. They don't get the damage rerolls, and they cost a bit more per unit, but I also think that they're very effective melee damage dealers for the Chaos Marines with characters, and I've given them a 9 out of 10 here as well. Next up, we've got Chaos Terminators, 180 points per 5 of them or 360 per 10. As you'd expect, they've just got fairly elite stats all the way around, and they wind up being a bit of a jack of all trade unit but master of none as a result. They've got nice tanky toughness individually, with 3 wounds, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and a big toughness 5. They're fairly fighty with their power fists, though per the points they don't have a massive amount of attacks. They do have some shooting with their combi weapons, and they do have the option to deep strike onto the board. That means that they can be quite a nice rapid ingress threat potentially, dropping out somewhere out of line of sight, and then moving and getting a very easy charge when it gets back to your turn. Their special rule is quite a nice one as well. Between dark pats and rerolling all hit rolls, they're going to cause a fair bit of damage against whatever they hit. Certainly one of the fightier Terminators out there in Warhammer 40k. And just in general, between all the things that they've got going on, a little bit of shooting, some solid enough melee, and some okay durability, almost all the detachments can have their core buffs work on them, whether it's enhanced stat lines from creations of Bile, bigger damage from Packbound with those inbuilt rerolls, or extra AP and advance and charge from Renegade Raiders. In general though, they don't seem to be put on the table quite as much as say Chosen, Possessed or Legionaries. I think perhaps partly just because they're a little bit general purpose and less specialised. It does mean that they may be an easy-ish unit to use and at least get some value out of though. But I guess they're paying for both good deep strike and good durability, so it means that their damage output isn't going to be massively excessive. I'd say that their leader options maybe aren't quite as optimal compared with the on-foot things with Lords. It's maybe a bit of a shame that Abaddon's main buff overlaps with the reroll buff from the Terminator datasheets, as it just means that he has a bit less synergy with them than you'd kind of hope, as they're sort of the unit you'd expect him to lead. In any case, I've given them a 7 out of 10. Definitely not useless at all, but maybe just a little bit lesser played than the previous two. Next up, we've got the Chaos Possessed, 120 points for 5 big hulking demon-infested Chaos Space Marines, 240 points for 10. Again, these guys are a bit of a generalist unit. They move really quite fast at 9-inch movement, and will get on well with advance and charge options in all the detachments that have them there. They're at least fairly sturdy on the defensive, at 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable save. That's really not too bad at all for 24 points each. And when they hit home, they've got damage that will clear out medium infantry quite well. Mass attacks at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2, and a chaos icon to allow them to reroll failed dark packs. When they first hit home, they'll be using their devastating wounds rule most likely, and that's quite big on such a big amount of attacks that they can spit out, meaning that they should take a good chunk out of basically whatever happens to get in their way, though they will be stand out against sort of medium infantry like standard enemy space marines. These guys really get on well with the creations of Bile Detachment, which is pretty nice for them, particularly given that that's the most played Chaos Space Marine detachment at the moment, though again we'll enjoy any of the other things that help out melee combat, maybe things like extra AP from Renegade Raiders, or going undivided in pack bounds to allow you to use that stratagem with the 4 wound rerolls and get more devastating wounds. For their main downsides, they're not really all that good against tougher stuff with higher saves, particularly anything that's toughness 10 or more, they'll be wounding on 6s, which is pretty bad for them, and devastating wounds can be really quite swingy depending on how many 6s you roll. They also may be a little bit of a shame that their leader option doesn't add so much in the Master of Possession. They're certainly the sort of unit that would have taken leader buffs well if they had good ones. I've chosen to give them an 8.5 out of 10 here, a really solid Chaos Space Marine unit, and they do seem to be extra standout in creations of Bile compared with other places. Next up for on-foot Chaos Marines, we've got the Nemesis Claw. This one's the Night Lord Kill Team unit, 110 points for 5 of them, or 190 for 10. They're basically a side grade on the standard Legionary datasheet, some interesting gear with a bunch of funky melee weapons that work quite well against lighter infantry, but they do have enough attacks and AP to punch up. Slightly tweaked special rules, getting damage buffs against things that are already at least slightly damaged. Stealth at range for a little bit more durability, though the big thing that they have is their Voice Eater special rule, which has a really unusual ability just to flat out prevent the enemy using stratagems while their squad's in engagement range with these guys. It only works against things that aren't monsters and vehicles, but it could be a huge deal if the opponent's got a unit that just revolves around using one stratagem, and they just turn this off and force them to use their resources elsewhere. For downsides, they're only OC1, they've not got quite as much raw damage as the Legionaries, with their big rerolls and being cheaper, and the Deny Stratagem thing I think is a bit more of a sort of top level 40k play type rule, particularly on a unit that might take some serious damage if it gets into melee with the wrong thing. The opponent's still going to spend the command point somewhere on the board and will likely get a good advantage from it elsewhere as well, even if you have turned it off in one given conflict, and that's even if they wanted to use a stratagem on that unit in the first place. I feel like maybe to get the best use out of it, you need to understand the opponent's army quite well and know when to commit them to turn off the stratagem at the right phase. Feels like just the sort of thing that tends to have a bit more impact on big thinking grand tournaments, more so than most players' games, where maybe a bit more damage and defense could just have been more useful. It's definitely a fun and powerful special rule though. I have seen some people taking them in competitive lists from time to time. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here. Next up, while not in Codex Chaos Space Marines, I thought I'd give a mention to the Cult Marines, not strictly in Codex Chaos Space Marines, but can be taken as allies essentially. Again, the relevant keywords so they can use the detachment buffs and stratagems. They don't get the core Dark Pacts rule though, and they can't use their own special rules from their own codex, but still provides some interesting deity dedicated options. I feel like probably the most standout of them are the Rubric Marines, though maybe more so in Renegade Raiders than elsewhere. They're OC2 and have a bunch of Warp Flamer shots for Strength 4, AP1 and Ignores cover, and then they get inbuilt rerolls, getting better against objective marker units. That pairs very nicely with Renegade Raiders, where they can advance and shoot and get further AP against those things on objectives, and that can just give them massively murderous damage output against most things in the game, though particularly infantry, and also have some pretty savage overwatch as well to dominate the midboard. They are priced at a bit of a premium though. In Thousand Sons, they're kind of paying for the rituals overall that their army gets, and they are a bit on the fragile side as well. I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here, maybe a little bit higher than that in Renegade Raiders perhaps. Otherwise, for Khorne Berserkers, their OC2, Mass Strength 5 and Damage 1 attacks with Blood Surge, I feel like in general for the 90 points they'd usually struggle to compete with Legionaries with Lords and Rhinos. With the Dark Packs, the Legionaries are generally going to do more damage, so in general the Khorne Berserkers mainly just have the Blood Surge as their selling point, and I'm just not sure that's really enough for the trade-offs really. I've given them a 6 out of 10 here, not really unusable but they feel suboptimal. For the Plague Marines of the Death Guard, they're 90 points per 5 or 180 per 10. They have their very slightly boosted toughness statistic and get quite a lot of fun punchy weapons and war gear in their squad, a bunch of specials and heavy plague weapons. Again, I feel like they're interesting enough, not completely useless. I might like some of the various detachments enhancements, though again I feel like I've very rarely seen them in any sort of competitive list, just due to competing against things like Legionaries and Chosen that already do that role quite well. Lacking the Contagions of Nurgle and the best buffing characters from the Death Guard, I think doesn't really help them too much. I've also given them a 6 out of 10 here. Finally, we're waiting on the update for the Noise Marines. I presume that they will be able to be taken by the Codex from the new Codex Emperor's Children, but Games Workshop will need to do a digital update for that. It seems again they could quite enjoy the Renegade Raider buffs though for extra AP on their weapons. Sonic weapons with Ignore's cover and getting an extra pip of AP does seem to be pretty savage, and they can still advance and shoot there as well. Will be interesting to see if any lists decide to use new style Noise Marines there. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. One option to get a table full of Warhammer 40k terrain on the board, and their option is quite a bit different to most people's out there. The idea for their stuff is that you have a grid system of 12 different tiles making up a 45 by 60 inch board, the right size for Warhammer 40k. And then each one of the cardboard tiles unfolds, and from each one up pops a building. So basically it's a folding cardboard terrain system that can fold completely flat, and it's really quite easy to transport and store, as when it's all folded down it fits in the same size box as say a normal board game. If you're interested in their stuff, there'll be links down in the video description. They've got a few different designs for different themed boards, and some big centerpiece things that you can make from putting two tiles together. I feel like the terrain set does come with some of its pros and cons versus other ones. The folding design and portability does have its trade-offs versus other sets. I'll talk through those a little bit more at the end of the video for those who are interested, some of the advantages and common criticisms. If you want to check them out though, they'll be linked down in the video description. And of course a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video and making big projects like this one happen. Moving on, next up we have some jump infantry, and first up we have the Raptors, 90 points per 5 of them or 170 for 10. These guys are standard Chaos Space Marines that move faster with their jump packs than the fly keyword, and they also have deep strike too. At 90 points they can be a cheapish unit that can deep strike for secondary objectives, and they're quite commonly used for that role in Codex Chaos Marines. It seems at least fairly common to see exactly one unit of 5 of them in competitive lists. Their movement and deep strike does have some advantages versus Chaos Bikers, which in general I think are a bit more impressive from the durability and damage point of view for the cost. The Raptors can have a bit of a sting though, with 2 special weapons and a Power Fist in the unit if you want them. Otherwise they've got a leadership debuff rule, which often doesn't tend to be the most impactful thing in Warhammer 40k, but it could matter from time to time when skirmishing over objectives. And they do get some jump pack synergies in Dread Talons, though that's maybe a weakness in its own way given that that's one of the less well balanced detachments out of the core Chaos Codex. For their weaknesses, I think for the points cost they're just not really pointed as mainline damage dealers really, and they're not really all that cheap as a utility unit either at 90 points, making them feel like they're just a little bit of the luxury for their abilities, or at least having a bit of threat. As mentioned, I don't really feel like their stats compare particularly well to Chaos Bikers besides the movement options that they have, and there's a fair few options for sort of mid-threat Chaos units in this range, perhaps things like cheap screening cultist chaff. Still though, definitely not unusable, though probably more focused on using them as secondary objective doers and things. I've given them a score of 7.5 out of 10 here. Their all very possessed counterparts are the Warp Talons. These are 125 points per 5 of them or 170 per 10, so a lot more expensive for the big unit. And these guys are fast moving jump infantry with paired talons. They give you a whole flurry of strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1 attacks, all twin linked with dark packs. And that means that they will be able to force a good amount of saves on basically everything, even if those saves will fail at damage 1. They will utterly shred 1 wound infantry though, and most 2 wound marine equivalents won't like getting hit by them either. They move quite fast, hit quite hard, and again like most of the melee damage buffs that they can get, including plenty of things from Creations of Bile and the rest. And then their special trick is their return to reserves thing, which is quite an interesting option. After they slay an enemy unit in melee, they get to return to strategic reserve, so they can either come down next turn and try and make a 9-inch charge, or drop in safety for the next turn, or use rapid ingress to jump back somewhere safe, and then bound out to shred another unit. That can be really quite a big thing, as it just means that they wouldn't play the normal unit trading game that lots of things do. You could literally have a melee unit jump out, kill something, and then the opponent just can't hit it back. Compared with Codex release, they are pointed at a bit more of a premium for that though. The small squad's 125 points, and in general that'll only be able to handle quite small units reliably, things like 1 wound infantry that's cheap and objective scoring type stuff. And then if you want the big unit that can take down some more serious targets, then that's going to cost a massive 270 points, though I've still seen people taking them from time to time. Either way, the points cost are still quite high though, and it means that if the opponent does manage to target them, then they're not really all that durable for the cost, and even with inbuilt rerolls and dart packs, they might struggle to take down the toughest stuff around, generally meaning they're going to be a lot more helpful against certain chaff units than others. If they do go for something a bit borderline as well, then they could be left high and dry if they say fail to kill the last enemy model and they have to remain on the board. Even with the downsides, I think they are interesting enough though. In games where it makes sense to invest on them, they could be literally picking up a 1 wound chaff unit per turn, and then going into reserve with the enemy not being able to do too much about them, and overall I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Marines with heavy weapons in the Havocs, 125 points for a unit of 5 of them, and that gets you a squad of slow-moving but up-armoured Chaos Space Marines with toughness 5, bearing 4 heavy weapons plus some fun sergeant gear, maybe the most common ones being 4 las cannons or 4 Reaper chain cannons, damage boosted by their dark packs. Their damage is quite reliable as well and should often get the first strike, maybe hiding out of line of sight either behind a ruin or in a rhino or similar, and they also have the extra reliability of ignoring modifiers for their datasheet rule. They'll enjoy anything that can boost direct damage, things like Veterans of the Long Wars core rule, the boosted marks from Pact Bound, or Renegade Raiders with their assault and extra AP against objectives. They do have quite strong damage output for the cost. For their weaknesses, the main one is that they're a lot slower versus gun tanks for the most part and not as durable, and even if they did take some chip damage and lost a marine or two, that can mean that the firepower of the squad drops quite significantly quite quickly. As a result, it feels like they're in the region where they're kind of usable but a bit overshadowed by the various different flavours of gun tanks. It's far more common to see people using Predators and Vindicators versus Havocs, even if they're not really that bad. I've chosen to give them a 7 out of 10 here. For the other Space Marine fire support infantry, we've got the Obliterators. They're 160 points per 2 of them. Quite hefty profiles with a bunch of wounds and high saves, and fairly flexible firepower at the sort of 18 to 24 inch range, a melter shot at 18 inches that can be quite good against the toughest tanks around, and other good ones to handle medium infantry or lighter hordes. Once per game they have the quite powerful rule to hit something with indirect fire, and that can be all very nice if it's something that the opponent desperately needed to keep safe, whether it's a fragile damage dealer or an objective grabber. If it makes sense to, then they can deep strike to deliver their shooting to something very safely, and compared with things like Havocs and gun tanks, they do actually have a fair amount of melee threat. 4 attacks each at strength 9 and damage 2 should really punish things that just want to tie them up and tag them, having kind of similar damage output against plenty of things as they do at range. Again, they'll enjoy anything that just amps up firepower in general. Veterans of the Long War could be interesting enough when paired with their indirect fire maybe. Pact Bound could give them more sustained hits with Nurgle, or Renegade Raiders could give them extra AP against objective grabbers that are hiding out of line of sight maybe. They'd also enjoy being able to advance and shoot as well, as maybe one of their biggest weaknesses is only moving a very slow 4 inches when they're on the board. And that does mean that once they're down, the opponent might be able to back things away or hide things behind terrain, and then the Obliterators wouldn't really be able to catch them up. Otherwise, it's maybe a bit unfortunate that they can't drop in melter range anymore for their big guns taking out tanks. That's only 9 inch range and they have to drop over 9 inches away. And their main competition is the various flavours of fast-moving gun tanks, maybe things like Vindicators and Predators being the primary competition for them. I still say they're interesting enough though, certainly with the indirect firepower, and could even be an interesting choice for Creations of Bile if you happen to roll the +1 ballistic skill and can't get out of it. I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got Chaos Cultists, which seem to be fairly ubiquitous in competitive lists. Nice cheap mortal chaff to do the expendable work and grab objectives. 50 points for 10 normal humans with toughness 3 and a 1 wound, so that's really quite cheap for 10 OC, and potentially a good amount of board control if they want to, with a big footprint if they spread out to screen things. They get a really useful special rule at just 50 points for sticky objectives. That could be really nice to put on the home field, and it's definitely nice enough if their unit could advance safely up to the mid-board. And then when they're on the front lines, they're probably not going to do very much damage. Their dart packs could at least mean that they stack a few saves on something in a pinch if they need to just put the finishing touch on something. And certain units might struggle to wipe them out in a turn if they don't have enough attacks. If they're in Chaos Cults, then they have a bunch of benefits if you're running that one. Some top tournament lists in the past have run them with Fabius Bile there. For their downsides, they don't really have good damage or defense, but that isn't really their role. It's maybe a shame not to have the autogun and special weapon option that they used to have. That was generally taken a fair bit more, as you could inflict a tiny bit of damage at safe range as opposed to having to charge in to deal anything meaningful. and usually it doesn't really make sense to take their character upgrade options here or expand the squad to 20 men versus investing more in other units. Still though, they're almost never a bad idea to have some of in an army, some grunts to do secondaries, primary objectives with sticky things and screening. I've given them a 9 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got their more twisted brethren in the Accursed Cultists, 90 points for 8 of them, including 3 Torments, going up to a big 195 points, so a bigger cost on the bigger unit. Their main purpose is being a fairly annoying unit to deal with a few wounds and different defensive profiles, and Feel No Pain as well. They have the rather disturbing ability that when they're shot, they might be able to surge move into melee with something on objectives, so it's kind of dangerous to put units too close to them if you absolutely need to try and shoot them down this turn. It means that things that didn't really want to get into close combat with them might well do so, and even things that did might not get the charge bonus. Their damage output isn't enormous, but the Torments do have a bunch of Strength 5 and Damage 2 attacks that can at least threaten things like standard Space Marines and anything lighter, and they are the sort of profile that gets a bit better with things like the Dark Pact buffs and anything else that you can put on them. They work well with a few of the detachment rules, but perhaps the biggest buff for them is the Dark Commune, giving them an invulnerable save to make them far tankier and more annoying to take out, reliable Dark Pacts, and a really quite big movement and damage turn where they get to advance and charge and then get a boost in melee, where they can threaten to take down some far tougher stuff. If they don't have the Dark Commune, then they get the Scout move, though you can have both in the Chaos Cult, and they are a pretty central unit for Chaos Cult all around. Almost every single one of these sort of focal synergy things that you can do with it being best on them, as they're actually one of the damned keyword units that gets a lot of value from moving fast and hitting hard. The Dark Apostle enhancement that can heal them as well is quite nice. Overall, I'd still say that they're a good unit. They certainly pay a premium for their surge move shenanigans though, and Games Workshop stopped people from using it multiple times in the same turn. So facing against 3 squads of these with Dark Communes isn't quite as oppressively irritating as it was before. Aside from their shenanigans, their damage and defense are a little bit so-so for the cost, at least compared with previously, even if they do have multiple defensive profiles to annoy certain damage, and in general they won't really be a serious threat to tough stuff with high saves without outside buffs. Overall though, definitely an interesting unit and can be a big problem when they're trying to fight on objectives. I've given them an 8 out of 10 rating here. Next up for the damned keyword units, we've got the Traitor Guardsmen, 70 points for in theory slightly raised cultists. For the extra 20 points that you pay over the cultist mob, you get a bunch of ranged firepower and 3 special weapons within the unit. Their save is upgraded to a 5+, which gets the benefit of cover while you're on objectives, and they also have OC2 as well, so a bit more weight towards taking points. Again, a fair bit of the support from the Chaos Cult detachment works quite well for them, and I would rate them a fair bit better there. There's a couple of things that work on ranged things which seem to be best on them. In general though, for the majority of Chaos lists, people just generally tend to take cultists instead of these. These guys definitely do have better damage and defense, but as a result they're less expendable as you pay more points for them, and lacking the sticky objectives rule that the cultists get is quite a big deal as well. Even with the special weapons and the flak armor, they still ultimately aren't really all that dangerous or that tanky, even if they're a little bit less weak than the cultists in either area. As a result, I've given them a 5.5 out of 10 here. I think they're not really all that bad, but for the vast majority of army lists out there, you're probably going to do better with cultists as opposed to these guys. Finally, for the damned keyword infantry, we've got the Felgor Beastmen. These are 85 points per 10 of them, and get you a squad of mutants with toughness 4 and a 5+ save. Their main thing is a first turn strategic reserves arrival, and compared with cultists, they are a little bit sturdier with the toughness 4. Get a few more threatening melee weapons, though they do cost a lot more points. I do feel like 85 points is just too much for these guys though. They've just got very bad damage output for the cost, not really great defense either against any sort of small arms, and again just pay far more than the cultist or the traitor guardsman for the chaff style role, and I'm not sure that the first turn strategic reserves arrival really matters all that much. There's plenty of other units that could push up the board fairly quickly, and I don't feel like they're really all that valuable units to get into position nice and early. Overall, I feel like they're pretty eclipsed even by the other damned units for their role. I've given them a 4 out of 10. Maybe one of them could be a sort of fun unit as a distraction turn 1, but I feel like in general you're probably going to be best off with some of the other flavours of chaff. Next up in the Parade of Mutants, we've got the Spawn. They're a Beasts unit and are 70 points for a set of 2 of them, each having toughness 5, 4 wounds and a 5+ feel no pain. They're sort of a mixed offering of at least somewhat fast, somewhat tough, and have some somewhat okay damage against marine equivalents with their damage 2, flailing limbs and things. Their special rule is to debuff enemy OC, which occasionally could be quite big on a tightly fought objective if you've got other things nearby to claim it. Otherwise they'll just be quite good for nuisance charging and tying up the enemy. For the downsides, it just means that OC0 is that they're just not a great utility unit for scoring things. They're not really all that standout for any one battlefield role. If you want cheap units, then cultists might be the way to go. If you want a bit of damage, then maybe Chaos Bikers or even Raptors could be more interesting, given that they can do objectives along the way. And as a result, the vast majority of lists don't take any of these guys. I feel like at OC1 they would have been a lot more interesting. Overall, I've given them a 4 out of 10. Moving on to bikes and vehicles for the Chaos Marines though, and next up we have the Chaos Bikers. They're 70 points per 3 of them, or 130 for 6, and I feel like these guys are just a fairly impressive data sheet all around. Good movement at 12 inches, fairly solid defense per point at 3 wounds at toughness 5, and perhaps surprisingly good damage output for a unit that's both fairly fast and fairly tough. They get 2 special weapons in the unit, get some chainsword attacks, the sergeant gets a power fist, and they also get a whole bunch of combi bolters, buffed by dark packs with the icon to re-roll them. They also get a strength boost on the charge as well, and they've got fairly good OC at OC6 for 70 points. For their biggest downsides, as they're a mounted keyword unit, they have to move around terrain, and that realistically means they're going to be a bit slower compared with things like Raptors. They tend to be best in small units, even if bigger units are a little bit cheaper due to having 2 specials per unit, and generally that's just helpful for their small unit utility type role. And for the most part, they don't really have the sort of critical mass they need to be a direct mainline damage dealer, even if they can punch up for a cheap squad. They may be a touch less relevant in Creations of Bile as well, as all the buffs that you get for that are infantry locked, so they make other things a bit more tempting. Overall though, they feel like they're a pretty strong unit for plenty of the detachments out there, nice and Renegade Raiders or Pack-Bound or Veterans of the Long War. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 for pure datasheet strength. Maybe in reality their single biggest weakness is that they've got some very old models that really need an update. Onto the Chaos Vehicle and Motor Pool, and first up we have the Rhino, 75 points for the dedicated transport of the Heretic Astartes. This one does the same as basically the other Rhino variants out there. Really quite cheap for a good defensive stat line, a big transport capacity of 12 to take some squads with leaders in it, a firing deck if it ever makes sense for things to remain embarked and fire out, some small arms on top with combi weapons and a Havoc launcher, a good movement and a small auto repair rule that can have them gradually regrowing if they're damaged. They absolutely see a fair bit of play in competitive lists, generally with Chosen or Legionaries with Lords attached jumping out of them to hit the enemy. If the enemy's within strike range, then you can get them out 3 inches out the front, so add that much to their threat range, and then off they go, maybe advancing and charging depending on the unit and the detachment. And if enemies aren't in range, then they can potentially zoom their way off into the midboard. Try and be in a position where they're either out of line of sight or their squad can disembark out of line of sight if it's popped. It's got the option to use smoke as well if that makes sense. In general though, it's just a very nice efficient transport for some staple Chaos Space Marine units, and as a result sees a lot of play in a bunch of detachments that has a few specific stratagem advantages in Renegade Raiders in particular. Overall really quite efficient and a very competitive unit. I've rated it a 9 out of 10 here. I feel like for weaknesses I guess it doesn't really do good damage output, but that's not exactly its battlefield role. For the more elite spiky Space Marine transport, we've got the Chaos Land Raider, 240 points for a massive armoured behemoth, 16 wounds with a 2+ save and toughness 12, so really quite hard to take down, and that quite likes things like cover and the Armour of Contempt equivalent stratagems in Veterans of the Long War or Renegade Raiders. It chips into anti-tank with some hard-hitting las cannons, though it's not really a direct damage dealer in itself, pointed in at the same sort of efficiency as the Predators or the Vindicators, and it's also tied with the value of delivering some scary chaos into melee, being able to move up, drop them out the front with its assault ramp, and then they can still charge. I feel like as a datasheet, the Line Raider's absolutely fine. Perhaps the main issue for Chaos Space Marines is that everything seems to be happy to do things other ways. Legionaries and Chosen both do really quite well with Rhinos, particularly as a lot of the detachments allow advancing and charging. That can be done for a stratagem and get a fairly similar threat range on a far cheaper transport vehicle. The Chosen can just do that innately too. Possessed move fast anyway, and just aren't really very efficient at filling it, given that you're going to be transporting a unit that costs around about half the amount as the Land Raider itself, and Terminators are kind of similar, taking up a lot of space, not really being the most standout melee damage dealers for the cost, and also could deep strike or rapid ingress to get where they need to be, plus have some good durability in their own right. As a result, it just feels like the Land Raider doesn't really have amazing options for what it transports into battle. I guess maybe Legionaries that don't want to use a stratagem could be one of the better options. I say overall though, it just tends to be an option that's just very solidly usable, but most optimised lists don't tend to make the investment for it. Next up we've got the Chaos Dreadnought monstrosity that is the Hellbrute, 130 points for 8 wounds worth of 2+ save walker, with a very flexible choice of heavy weapons or close combat. In general, most people seem to take one heavy weapon and one of the melee weapons, just because the melee weapons have so much more threat, even if it is going to be really quite slow and struggle to get into combat with things that don't want to be in melee with it. The biggest draw to taking the Hellbrute for Chaos Space Marines certainly seems to be its Dark Pact amplification though. You get both benefits of the Dark Pacts as opposed to just one. So you can get both sustained and lethal hits on a whole bunch of things shooting or fighting. With the emphasis on the Dark Pacts and being able to get them to go off on a 5+, it means that the Hellbrute is just far more useful in pack-bound zealots than basically anywhere else. And potentially if you want to go for a really build tall Chaos list, you can pair him with Abaddon the Despoiler, and then you have units that will be doing Dark Pacts on a 5+ and re-rolling all the hit rolls, so you get more 5+s. For downsides, the actual stat line, movement, and damage output of the Hellbrute just isn't really all that good. It's definitely paying a big premium for the Dark Pacts, so optimised lists are generally never really going to want more than one of them. And also bear in mind that while the Dark Pact thing does sound kind of great, you will always essentially be adding the less good of either sustained hits or lethal hits compared with the one that you already had, as you pick that anyway. And say adding lethal hits against something that you're wounding on a 3+ anyway isn't really the biggest damage boost in the world. Still definitely useful in the right army list though, more so in pack-bound zealots than elsewhere. I've chosen to give him an overall 7 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Chaos Predator tanks, 130 points for the Annihilator and 140 for the Destructor, generally seen as fairly adequate general purpose gun turrets with pretty reasonable defense for the cost, with 11 wounds at toughness 10, and they have quite long range with their weapons as well. The Annihilator brings dedicated anti-tank to the table with its reroll damage rolls that go off on all numbers, not just ones now, and the Destructor gets its boosted AP against elite infantry with a whole bunch of damage 3 shots. That can be quite nice in Renegade Raiders in particular, with the extra AP for things on objectives, meaning that you can get that to effectively AP 3. I still probably rate the Destructor slightly higher despite the extra points that it pays. Just very hard to go wrong with Dark Pacts plus Las Cannon sponsons and the autocannon on the turret. For weaknesses, as you'd expect, there may be a fairly optimal target for anti-tank, though perhaps more so than the vast majority of the rest of the Chaos army, given that lots of things have Demon Invulnerable saves or 2+ saves. Las Cannon equivalents will make fairly short work of these, and otherwise perhaps face some solid competition from Vindicators. Speaking of which, they're perhaps the other most played gun tanks around, generally seeing a lot of use both for Chaos Space Marines and the Loyalists these days. They do have a fairly terrifying main gun with D6 plus 3 shots at strength 14 and damage D6, and with blast keyword that can be fairly threatening against elite infantry as well as tanks. Dark Pacts can give you some sustained hits as well, and will like any of the general Chaos shooting buffs, say the Mark of Nurgle for pack bound, Renegade Raiders with the advance and shoot and the extra AP, and veterans of the Long War rerolls potentially. It could be a more interesting choice to make into a Daemon Engine in Soulforged as well perhaps. Otherwise they've got a very sturdy defensive profile, despite having a high cost, a good number of wounds at toughness 11 and a 2+ save, and their datasheet rule allows them to fire within melee at good effect, which is kind of nice as maybe one of their bigger weaknesses is having a slightly shorter range at 24 inches, not being quite as long range and general purpose as those Predator tanks. For other downsides, they may have a very slightly shorter move range, and their damage output can be potentially swingy as well, with a d6 to roll both on the number of shots and on the actual damage output of the thing. Either way though, they're still very efficient and really quite scary gun tanks. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10 here. I could have been persuaded to give them a 9 as well. Next up, we've got some Daemon Engines, and starting out there's the Defiler. This one's 190 points and has some fairly general purpose shooting with its battle cannon and twin las cannons or other options, and some fairly big hitting melee with those big claws against tough stuff, or strike it at strength 16 and damage d6 plus 1. It can scuttle over low-lying terrain, and the Daemon Engines get a lot of support options with the Soulforged War Pack, where basically all of them are a lot stronger there compared with elsewhere. For the Defiler, it is a big points investment, and its big profile can be kind of hard to hide, and it still might have trouble moving around terrain due to the sheer size of the thing, even despite that scuttling walker rule. It's not really super fast or standout tough either, and it might struggle to make melee with the things that it most wants to. I feel like all around for 190 points it's just a kind of middling sort of threat, where if the opponent's got a good amount of shooting then it's probably going to be a fairly prime target. I don't really think it's unusable, but maybe just feels a little bit weaker than a few of the Daemon Engines out there. I've not seen them played in competitive quite so much as some of them. I've given it a 6.5 out of 10 overall, though I'd rate them all better in the Soulforged War Pack. Next up, we've got the Forge Fiend, 190 points worth of dedicated Daemon Engine firepower, firing out with its ectoplasma cannons with 3d3 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3. That profile's really general purpose, strong enough to threaten medium battle tanks and things. Multiple copies of Blast means that it's really quite good against hordes and elite infantry squads, and Dark Pacts amps it up further, giving you lethal hits against tough stuff, and it also gets devastating wounds when it needs to as well, at the price of making the weapons hazardous. It quite likes being undivided in pack-bound zealots for reroll wound rolls from a stratagem if you want to use that. And again, Soulforged Warpack will give it loads of advantages, including a potential +1 to wound, which makes it very good even against tough stuff, as well as the other stratagem options there. It is a big and scary enough thing to maybe warrant buffing with a Warpsmith as well, or maybe things like Abaddon and Hellbrutes if you're building a scary Chaos shooting castle. For the downsides, it's just not really quite as tough as things as Vindicators or Predators for the points cost despite that invulnerable save. 190 points is quite a big premium for that defensive profile, and using Hazardous might mean that it drops even further. By the time the opponent shoots it, maybe it's dropped down to 9 wounds perhaps. It does feel like it pays a points premium for how general purpose the damage output is, and it does mean that you're paying a lot of points for being able to threaten most things. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10, still all very scary as a firepower piece. Most lists outside of Soulforged Warpack tend to be much more tempted to go with Predator tanks or Vindicators though. Next up, we've got the engine and melee destruction that is the Mauler Fiend. The other Dinobot clocking in at 130 points, so it's quite a lot more durable for the cost given that it has the same defensive stat line. And this is a big melee beast that has a bunch of attacks at strength 14, damage d6 +1 and AP 2. Fairly simple and direct anti-tank damage there, and then you've got a choice of either Lasher Tendrils or Magma Cutters, which can pack a fair punch at 6-inch range up close, and it quite enjoys things that can boost its damage further or give it things like Advance and Charge, as otherwise it's got 10-inch movement that needs to move around terrain, so against at least a fair few armies it might struggle to make charges without being exposed to enemy firepower first. It quite enjoys the move through walls thing that you can do with Soulforged Warpack, and there's really quite a lot of other good stuff for it there. For weaknesses, if not buffed somehow, the AP -2 is maybe a little bit on the low side, and as a ground-bound melee vehicle, it's got more chance to be screened out or shot down before making melee compared with some of the other things that it can inflict damage from more safe long ranges. Just typically for most Chaos Space Marine lists outside of Soulforged Warpack, it seems people are far more keen to go for more gun tanks for taking down tough stuff and then melee infantry to back it up, as opposed to the other way around. Overall, I give it a 7 out of 10, very usable for general purposes, though maybe not one of the most standout things, and like the rest of the Daemon Engines, better in Vashtor's detachment. The Venom Crawler is 120 points, so a little bit cheaper than the Mauler Fiend. This thing's maybe a little bit more fragile for the points cost, at only 9 wounds at toughness 9 for a similar sort of points cost to the Mauler Fiend, and the damage output it has is very much of one kind, very good at killing things like standard Space Marines or Horde Infantry Units, 12 shots at strength 6 and damage 2 at range, and another 6 in melee. If it wipes out units, then its datasheet rule gives you the chance to up the amount of attacks that it gets over the course of the game, so it might be nice enough to finish off sort of chaff units if it's able to. Again, as with the rest, it's far better in Soulforged Warpack versus the rest. The +1 to wound at range is really quite a nice one, and that makes it quite a lot more general purpose, though the low AP still might be an issue, and it's not really one of the big scary Daemon Engines that you really want to be targeting with stratagems quite so much as some of the rest. It's definitely usable enough, though I think between its low toughness for the points cost that it has, and also having damage output that's a bit weedy against either high saves in cover or high toughness targets, just makes it a little bit more specialised than some. I've given it a 7 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the Khorne Lord of Skulls, 450 points worth of Titanic Khornate Daemon Engine, also having the towering keyword, so if it noses in terrain then it can essentially see over it without using the obscuring rules. For the 450 points, it does have a pretty respectable defensive stat line. Toughness 13 and 24 wounds means that it's better against things like las cannons than some other super heavies, and plenty of armies will just have a lot of trouble actually bothering to try and destroy that, and it might be a better strategy to go after the rest of the army and try and just screen out the Lord of Skulls or ignore it. Its damage output is pretty massively big hitting though. In melee you get 5 attacks at strength 16 and damage 8, and its shooting is really quite fearsome as well. Lots of strength 14 with decent damage output. Like the rest of the Daemon Engines, Soulforged Warpack is all very nice for it. It's maybe one of the better ones with Fellhammer Siege Host as well. It also has some useful buffs for a big focal unit. For downsides, it could be a bit all or nothing. It's going to struggle to hide with that enormous profile, and some armies just have the massive damage output that'll kill it dead anyway. Anything with high strength and super high damage output is going to be bad news, and you could lose a whole chunk of your army. It's slightly slower moving than things like Knights at 8 inches, and doesn't have the rules for ghosting through terrain in the same sort of way. And if the opponent's got some annoying scouting chaff units, then it might find itself move blocked, which wouldn't be great for this many points and threat. I feel like just in general, for enormous single units with loads of damage and defense, but maybe not all that many sneaky tricks, it just might be a little bit more predictable as well, and do a bit better in more casual settings as opposed to hyper-competitive ones. I've seen some people taking it in Soulforged Warpack lists though. Overall, I'd rate him a 7 out of 10. Really quite a scary threat, but maybe not enormously stand out for the points cost. Finally, for the Daemon Engines, we've got the Aircraft and the Helldrake, 205 points for a fast-moving hover flyer, generally wanting to be in hover mode as opposed to starting in reserves, and then zooming up the board a big 20 inches, potentially being able to do annoying move block or charge things right from the first turn against the right foe. For its damage, it can strike with a Bale Flamer for some torrent damage to attacks, though not really all that many of them. Its only real good damage output comes from its talons if they happen to charge fly things, where you're going to be getting a lot of devastating wounds. For the downsides, being an aircraft in 10th edition isn't really the best start. Games Workshop always seems to point them at far higher points costs than is really reflective of their value, and the Helldrake isn't really an exception to this. OC0 means that it can't do objective things even if it's in hover mode, and that makes it a lot worse as a utility unit that you'd otherwise want to be able to do secondaries and things if it was zooming up the board straight away. Its durability is fairly bad for 205 points, and its damage output is pretty awful for 205 points unless it's literally against fly keyword units in melee. It's interesting that the core Chaos Helldrake has got a different profile to the Emperor's Children one now with its 2+ save and extra wounds. Makes me wonder if they might do some sort of errata to make it the same sort of profile and beef up its defense at some stage. At the moment though, unless you literally know that you're facing fly opponents, it's not really very good take all comers. I've given it a 4 out of 10 here. Finally, before we get into characters, we have the Noctilith Crown. This one's the Fortification unit for the Chaos Space Marines, and it's 125 points to put a great big baleful fortress on the battlefield. In previous incarnations, it did something useful like providing invulnerable saves, though unfortunately now they decided to trade its buff out for just literally a +1 leadership aura. It's literally only got that, a 6-inch range shooting attack that the opponent might never get within range of, and could potentially provide some cover to things behind it, though it's not exactly too hard to get cover saves in 10th edition in general. The +1 leadership does have the potential to help out with Dark Pacts. I guess in theory that could have some use on a tank firebase, making them go off a lot more reliably, but it's just not worth the 125 points to bring that to the army. You may as well just have another big scary tank threat, like basically another Predator Annihilator or something similar. Again, fortifications in 10th edition tend to be overcosted. OC0 and being immobile are both bad things as well. And overall it feels like it's perhaps the single weakest data sheet for Codex Chaos Marines. I've given it a 2 out of 10 here. Finally, for the Chaos Marines, let's talk special characters. We'll start off with epic heroes and then go through the generic ones. First up, we've got the big guy himself in Abaddon the Despoiler. 280 points for the Warmaster successor to Horus, and pretty much the big bad of the current setting. For that princely investment, he gets massive melee damage with 8 attacks at strength 14 and damage 3, or a bunch of sweeps. He generates command points when he uses Dark Pacts, though not 100% reliably. And then he gets a big aura choice for non-damned Chaos Space Marine units, usually with the choice being either reroll hit rolls, which can be huge for a big central buffing character around a bunch of gunline things, or a 4+ invulnerable save, which could be nice enough for certain infantry like say Chosen. The rerolls plus his own damage threat feels like the biggest thing really. He does have the potential to make a lot of chaos things a lot scarier. Could be nice in Pact-bound Zealots as well, with Dark Pacts going off on a 5+, but basically just quite good anywhere where it's not directly overlapping with a rule that you can already get reroll hit rolls with. For downsides, it's mainly just that absolutely enormous points cost. 280 is a big investment on anything, and you're going to be giving up a good chunk of other units to put him on the table. His personal durability isn't awful for a character, but really isn't good for 280 points if he does get exposed. It's slightly annoying that his 2 best buffs don't apply to Terminator units that he's leading, maybe making him a bit more tempting to go with Chosen perhaps, and also isn't so great with overlaps with the Veterans of the Long War for the Black Legion, which is where you'd think he'd be more thematically played. If he runs with Chosen as well, he won't be able to go in Rhinos, which is a downside given that that's one of the better ways of running them. But still, despite all that, he can still be a very interesting unit, massive damage threat, and a big buff, and some lists still make use of him for the big points investment. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10 overall here. Next up, we have the Mad Scientist Spider, who was formerly of the Emperor's Children. Fabius Bile is 85 points, and seems to have found himself a really shiny nice new detachment in the Creations of Bile. Really quite a good start for him, as he seems to be borderline auto-include in that, given that he allows you to reroll the buffs that the detachment gives if you happen to roll less useful ones. On top of that, for a cheap character leader, he does quite a lot for his unit. He gives you +1 strength and +1 toughness, which can be nice for Chosen in particular, though is good with other things too. He makes his squad tankier by changing 1 damage to 0 when it's allocated to his unit each turn, and that can often quite directly save a Chaos Space Marine's life. When he does get directly targeted and his squad gets cut down, he's really quite tough to kill in himself. He has a 5+ feel no pain and the ability to revive on death with a 2+ chance of success, and the Surgeon Acolyte can also take a hit as well when he's exposed, and then he does chip in with a bit of melee himself, with strength 5, AP -1, damage 3 and anti-infantry, plus some pistols. For downsides, I guess his damage isn't really all that big, and strength and toughness buffs are sometimes helpful but not always in every confrontation in 40k. and he might be competing with things like Chaos Lords to lead a bunch of the Chaos Battle Line and Elites. Overall though, he's definitely one of the stronger character datasheets, and doubly so in Creations of Bile. I've given him a 9 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got Harkon Worldclaimer, the Herald of Abaddon, a jump pack character for 90 points for the Black Legion. He can only lead Raptors, and for his damage he gets 6 attacks at strength 5 and damage 2 with precision, plus a bonus Hellspear attack at range and melee. And his buffing rule allows you to get mortal wound impact hits for Raptors that make it into engagement range, which could potentially be quite a lot of damage if he can make contact with a lot of them at once. He also causes battle shock for units within 6 inches for damaged units, and that can mean that occasionally opponents' units fighting in the midfield might actually have the chance of failing a key test and deny them some primary points. Not the most reliable debuff though. I feel like he does have some interesting things going for them. Maybe for weaknesses, it's a bit unusual to be using Raptors as primary damage threats, and I'm not sure that he really tips the balance on that all that much. His damage is okay and the mortal wounds help, but for 90 points plus the cost of the Raptor squad, it still doesn't give you an all-out threatening unit. It is maybe a bit of a downside that he can't lead Warp Talons. Otherwise, his buffs and debuffs might be a little bit on the situational side, and he might not be able to get quite as many units actually into engagement range as you'd want if he's leading a big squad, particularly if you only just make your charge with him. I think between all that for 90 points is kind of merely okay added value. I feel like he could be a little bit cheaper really. I've given him a 6.5 out of 10 overall. Next up we have the Tyrant of the Maelstrom in Huron Blackheart. He's an 80 point Chaos Lord and again has a similar sort of damage profile, 6 attacks at strength 5 and damage 2, plus also a strength 6 heavy flamer from his claw. The buffs that he gives his unit is +1 OC, and the ability to redeploy 3 infantry units or put them in strategic reserves before you know first turn, which can be nice enough for the Deceptors. Plus he gives his unit a once per game reactive move of d6 inches, which could allow him to do things like re-embark in transports if he's in range to. Overall I feel like all of those rules add value, but maybe a little bit less reliably so than say just a standard fighty Chaos Lord. The bonus OC might occasionally matter, but often won't tip the balance one way or the other, and he might have already had the objective. I guess it's not too bad with Chosen. The redeploys are okay, but I feel like often infantry aren't the units that you'd normally want to use them on. I feel like they often tend to be a bit more helpful on big chunky tanks and vehicles, trying to remain out of line of sight or get at the jump on the enemy. I guess potentially they could wrong foot people, and reactive moves are nice enough, but only once per game and only d6 inches isn't the most reliable in the world either. He might not move away far enough to be meaningful. Overall, despite having some interesting stuff, it feels kind of rare that he gets put in competitive lists too much. I've given him a 5.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got Cypher the Fallen Angel, the Lone Operative of Chaos, clocking in at 90 points to put on the table. Lone Operatives are generally pretty handy to have in Warhammer 40k, able to screen sections of the board without being shot, maybe stand on uncontested objectives, safely do secondary objectives and things, and Cypher can also back that up with a whole load of damage at close range as well. He gets 6 attacks at strength 4, AP 1, damage 1, and then 3 with strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 with his plasma pistol, and he gets that same profile both when shooting and also in melee as well. And between the two he can really easily go through entire squads, objective grabbers and say standard size Space Marines. Given that the pistols fully count as melee profiles as well, they can take advantage of anything that's good in melee as well, like buffs such as Creations of Bile. He does have the potential to return fire in the enemy turn as well if he's shot and not killed. Finally, he's also got an aura of +1 command points to stratagem costs for the enemy as well, which can be really quite disruptive. If he's able to survive somewhere in the midboard when the opponent's trying to fight on objectives nearby, that could be really massive. For his downsides, he isn't really stand out fast without any special deployment rules or scout or anything like that. He's also not super hard to kill if he's exposed as well. And at 90 points you don't really want to lose him too easily. He's not a super cheap lone operative. Still though, for the sheer amount of damage that he does, plus the extra command point thing, he does feel like a very strong Chaos unit, and I've given him a 9 out of 10 rating here. Finally for the epic heroes, we've got Vashtor the Archithane, just 175 points for the incarnation of the demigod of the Forge on the mortal plane. He basically has the stat line of a very sturdy demon prince, 14 wounds at toughness 10 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and at least some fairly solid melee damage with a strength 14 hammer with anti-vehicle and devastating wounds or some sweep attacks. He gives an aura of +1 strength to demon vehicles nearby and can mess with the enemy by making nearby shooting hazardous as well. So maybe a bit of a dangerous one to try and gun down at close range. He could be interesting just with the sheer amount of Daemon Engines on the board in his Warpack formation, and he can use a couple of the stratagems there as well. Despite the Soulforged Warpack being kind of all about him, he still doesn't provide loads of synergy there though. The +1 strength sometimes matters big, but often might not. It depends a lot on exactly what he's buffing and what targets they're shooting at, and outside of that formation, a lot of people tend to more go for tanks anyway, as opposed to Daemon Engines, which he won't be able to improve. For his actual damage and defensive stat line, he'll be competing with other direct damage dealers, where if not providing some synergy or something, then people could be taking things like Vindicators or Predators for their ways to deal with tough stuff. His damage output definitely isn't terrible, but not really much more impressive than say a Mauler Fiends for example. Overall, I'd give him a 7 out of 10, definitely has some interesting stuff going on, probably better in the Soulforged Warpack than elsewhere though. Moving on to generic characters finally, and first up we have the standard Chaos Lord. He's 90 points, and I certainly mentioned him a fair bit alongside Legionaries and Chosen, just because he can add an enormous amount of fight to them, and also provides free stratagems at the same time, which can matter a bit more or less depending on the detachment. Maybe things like the advance and charge options can be a good one, and various different damage buffs, or Armour of Contempt equivalents between the different Chaos ones. In melee he hits very hard with a Demon Hammer that goes into Rage mode for one big turn of glory. And then it's 6 attacks at Strength 9, AP -3 and Damage 3 with Devastating Wounds and whatever buffs Dark Pacts give on top of that. Potentially also if he's got Chaos Legionary rerolls on the go, that could mean that he can punch off against really tough stuff a lot easier. Overall, between all that, he's just a very scary melee threat that makes them a lot more well-rounded and able to tangle with tough stuff a lot better. I guess perhaps for weaknesses, the stratagems can be a little bit detachment dependent, and the damage will drop off a fair bit after his one really big turn. But overall, I think he's a very efficient leader. I've given him a 9.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got his counterpart with a jump pack, a 90-point Chaos Lord with fly, and he can only lead Raptors. He gets a fairly similarly threatening melee profile, though doesn't get the single big turn of massively boosted damage and the free stratagems otherwise. I guess he could use the free stratagems for a discounted rapid ingress if he wanted. His special rule is to allow you to buff pile-in and consolidate moves to get more units into the fight, which is okay but nowhere near quite as good as the big damage boost I think. And he can access some options in Dread Talons that others can't, like the Return to Reserves enhancement option. For the downsides, the main one is maybe that he's only able to join Raptors, which just don't feel quite as optimal as a mainline damage threat like he normally wants to make them. It's not that you can't do it, but it's just generally considered that other things will be a bit more efficient. Overall, I've given him a 7 out of 10, not unusable for his datasheet rules, though just a bit niche and maybe doesn't do quite enough to make Raptors into a really serious melee threat that they'd ideally want to be with him. The Lord in Terminator armor is 95 points, again brings the discounted stratagems, and in Terminator armor he gets a pretty beefy profile with a choice of different war gear, and his defensive rule makes him really quite sturdy, giving him half damage, and perhaps paired with some enhancements could be really quite durable even if running solo. He might be of interest with Terminator things in the Felhammer Siege host as well potentially. Again, like the Jump Pack Lord, certainly not awful. The Terminator squads don't tend to be quite as commonly built around as things like Chosen Legionaries and Possessed for frontline damage threats as mentioned. His durability boost rule is only going to be relevant after he's lost his bodyguard as well, so might only be active a bit later in the day to help his squad. Overall I've given him a 7 out of 10, again usable enough though maybe not crazily standout. Next up we've got the Master of Executions. He's 80 points and can join Legionary squads or Chosen. His damage output gives a fairly scary 5 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2 with Precision and Devastating Wounds to take the heads of some characters potentially. And that mid-strength profile with the Devastating Wounds definitely gets on well with the Chaos Legionary reroll to wound boost. If he kills a character, then he generates a command point, which is handy enough. Kind of niche though, and if he does that, then he's already doing quite well. And he boosts his unit with reroll hits if they're below starting strength, and reroll wounds below half strength. If he wants to, he can make a super fighty Chaos squad, joining a squad alongside a Chaos Lord, and maybe making a Legionary squad that's just ridiculously dangerous. For downsides, he doesn't really have quite the same sort of durability as the Chaos Lords, and if you're doubling down on characters, then that's going to be a unit that's really very easy to kill for the points cost, as it just costs so many points for a fairly similar defensive profile. And if you're just taking one character to lead for the squad, people often tend to go for the Chaos Lord rather than him. He just hits a fair bit harder in melee. The free stratagems are probably more reliably useful than the damage buffs when your squad's injured, given that your squad might not be injured the first time it activates. And even the precision can be done by the Chaos Lord as well if you spare a command point for epic challenge when you desperately need it. As a result, I still rate the Chaos Lord as overall the better character, though I think that this guy isn't that far behind and he can double up. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10 here. Next up we've got the Warpsmith, 70 points for basically the Chaos Tech Marine. He can be filled in next to vehicles where he gains the lone operative keyword if he's within 3 inches of them, which could be handy enough to do certain secondaries or even stand on primaries if the enemy is not too close to him. For his primary boost, he heals D3 wounds and gives +1 to hit for a vehicle, and Chaos vehicles might have reason to need the repairs with Dark Pacts as well. His stats are okay for a support character with a 2+ save and a variety of close range attacks, and he could be a good choice for bearing certain enhancements that you just want somewhere on the board, but you don't necessarily want being put in danger and moving up towards the enemy and potentially getting killed on a fighty character. He also gets a bonus rule for handing out battle shock to a nearby vehicle, but that's kind of niche and not really the most useful thing he does. For weaknesses, he's maybe not really seen as super necessary, and even armies that take a whole bunch of vehicles might not necessarily run any warp smiths. The vehicles have adequate damage already with dark pacts, maybe making the extra +1 to hit just a little bit less critical to have anyway. He's maybe not crazily hard to kill for when the opponent catches up with him and has a fairly higher points cost equivalent versus his loyalist rival in the Primaris Tech Marine as well for doing a very similar thing. He's certainly more of a staple character in the Soulforged War Pack though, being able to bear some good enhancements to help out the Daemon Engines nearby. I'd say he's maybe usable rather than stand out in most attachments besides that one though. I've given him a 7 out of 10 here. Next up we've got the Demon Princes, the one on foot and the winged one. For the on foot variant, they've got a big toughness 10 and 10 wound profile with a 2+ save and 4+ invulnerable. Some sort of middling melee damage at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3, plus a small shooting attack, and having a fairly big chunky stat line is interesting enough on a character, as any enhancements that directly boost his damage or defense can maybe have a bit of excess value on dangerous melee profiles or good defensive stats. He hands out cover to nearby infantry, has some inbuilt rerolls, and can get a further boost depending on what deity mark that he takes. For downsides, his durability is only kind of okay when he's in the open. His own damage output can be pretty weak against things that are toughness 9 or higher, which maybe isn't that great in a big central threat like him. He's not really super fast and will need to go around terrain with the monster keyword. A lot of units can get cover at least fairly easily, though I guess it's definitely not awful to make infantry a bit harder to take out in the midboard. And might have a bit of competition with the Winged Prince who can hit a fair bit harder. Between all that, he does seem to be a bit on the niche side. I've given him a 6 out of 10 here. Again, not really unusable, but not really stand out in the damage or defensive things, so maybe need a very specific reason like an enhancement or a specific battle plan to run him. The Winged Demon Prince is maybe a little bit scarier. He costs more at 180 points and probably gets similar things to the on foot one for stat line purposes. He moves a bit faster and has the fly and deep strike keywords and drops his toughness to toughness 9 rather than toughness 10. The Winged Demon Prince trades out his special rules for a big mortal wound impact hits though. You roll a dice for each one of his wounds left, and on a 4+ the enemy takes a mortal wound whenever this Demon Prince makes a charge, and that means that he'll take a good chunk out of anything that he contacts. He also has a battle shock when he's moving over enemy units, though that tends to be far less impactful. For the downsides, he's even less durable in the open or on the counter attack. That mortal wound rule is going to hit a lot less hard when he's damaged, so you might need to make sure that he gets delivered at full health, potentially using something like rapid ingress. Overall, he can hit hard, though I feel like he's going to be competing against just the generic Chaos Space Marine melee damage options that you can take in infantry squads, things like Possessed and Legionaries and Chosen, all of which also get on a bit better with Creations of Bile as well. I still say it's an interesting datasheet though, with that big hitting mortal wound damage. I've given him a 7 out of 10 here. The Lord Discordant on his Hellstalker is 175 points and doesn't really seem to have had a great time in 10th edition, almost to the point where it feels like Games Workshop's deliberately giving him an edition where he's not good, after being really quite strong prior to now. For 175 points you get a mounted character unit, with at least a fairly punchy torrent attack with his Bale Flamer, plus some close range melter shooting, and then a flurry of attacks that are in close combat with strength 6, and several rules that only really affect enemy vehicles, debuffing one within 12 inches with a small chance to prevent shooting, making your army reroll wound rolls against one nearby vehicle. And like the Demon Princes, I guess could be interesting enough for enhancements that improve his damage or defense, being quite a big valuable character that could get good value out of boosts. For his abilities though, I feel like he'd need to be significantly cheaper to be looked at with interest. His debuff rules only work against one type of unit that might not be in the enemy army at all. The debuff things are really quite close range. He's not really all that fast, and the mounted keyword means that he needs to go around terrain. He's not really very tough for the cost and doesn't really have all that much damage either for 175 points. And for some reason they didn't give him the Daemon Engine style keywords, so he doesn't even work particularly well in the Vashtor detachment, which is where you think that he'd have some success if anywhere. Overall, he'd just need to be massively cheaper than he is now to really be all that interesting. I've given him a 3 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Chaos Preacher to convert the masses that is the Dark Apostle, 75 points for essentially the Chaos Chaplain equivalent with his Dark Disciples. He gives you a +1 to wound for the melee unit that he's leading, and chips in with his own Strength 6, AP 1 and Damage 2 melee, and gives you better leadership and cancel Battle Shock rules nearby. As well as that, the Dark Disciples add some value as well, being quite good for catching a few big hits given that they have invulnerable saves, or occasionally could be expended for some mortal wounds in melee if that makes more sense. And they can bear some quite nice enhancement options for Chaos Cult, such as the one that allows them to resurrect the Accursed Cultists. Overall, for 75 points, I think he does add quite a lot of value. Again, he would be conflicting with leading things like Legionaries and Chosen with the standard Chaos Lord, and most tend to go with him rather than the Dark Apostle. He maybe doesn't have the best interaction with transport slots for Rhinos as well, given that due to the Dark Disciples he can't ride alongside 10 other Space Marines in those, and that's not the best for fitting them neatly into transports. I think he does have some downsides, but is otherwise a fairly solid enough leader. I've chosen to give him a 7 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Chaos Sorcerer. 60 points for the generic Psyker for the faction. A bit sad that in 10th edition he doesn't get the option of choosing a bunch of different spells like in the past. Now he's limited to giving his units a -1 to hit, and then some psychic shooting that might have the chance to double down with some extra mortal wounds if the enemy fails a leadership test. Unfortunately, those put together just don't really add up to all that much for 60 points, particularly weighed up against the other characters. And adding the psychic keyword to a unit can be a bit of a downside in its own way as well for things that are good against them. He just feels a lot more clipped by various other leaders out there. I've given him a 4 out of 10. The Terminator Sorcerer I think is a fair bit more interesting though. He's an 80 point fairly durable infantry character who actually has quite a good debuff rule where if you can get within 12-inch range of an enemy unit, he can make everything AP -1 better against them, which could apply to a whole bunch of damage for a bunch of Chaos Space Marine shooting or close combat just about to charge that squad. Like the regular Sorcerer, he has a bunch of psychic damage plus some melee with his staff as well, and he also allows you to reroll advance and charge rolls for his unit, which I guess could be handy enough getting a Terminator squad into melee. I feel like perhaps one of the bigger downsides is having to commit to a big Terminator squad if you want him to have a retinue. By that point you've got a unit that kind of in no way really justifies the buff, though I guess you could run him solo as just a cheap deep striking objective doer type guy who might be able to put out that powerful debuff against the right enemy if it made more sense. His defense isn't awful as a Terminator character, and he does have a once per game blanker damage special rule from his familiar, so maybe it's a little bit more viable to run solo than some. Definitely interesting, though maybe not the easiest to use. His debuff rule does need to get close, which is a big downside. I've chosen to give him a 7 out of 10 once more. Really quite an interesting rule, but perhaps not the easiest to include in any one army practically. Next up, we've got the Master of Possession, who's got a really fun miniature, though didn't have the best rules in 10th in my opinion. He's 70 points and he can lead the Chaos Possessed, giving them a +1 to advance and charge, and otherwise mainly being about his own damage, with a sniping anti-psyker attack with 2 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 3, and he can boost that with dark pats and a +1 to hit and wound if he inflicts a mortal wound on his own unit. Between that, there is at least some chance that he might be able to snipe out a character if there's even good targets for him, though he could still come on stock against invulnerable saves and things. He also chips in a little bit of melee damage at strength 6 and damage D3, and he could be used to get enhancements into possessed squads, given that he's the only character choice that can lead them. Unfortunately for the 70 points, he just doesn't really add all that much for his cost to the squad. He was a lot better, I thought, when he had the 6+ feel no pain in the unit as well. The boosted advance and charges are definitely handy enough, particularly in detachments when they can advance and charge, but it's still not really a movement buff that's really worth buying an entire character in for. Otherwise he's got that precision strike, which can be good against the right foe, but not all armies really care about it that much, and he might not have the chance to use it. And overall, between all that, when people run possessed squads, they tend to be without the Master of Possession as opposed to with one. I've given him a 5 out of 10 overall. Not completely useless, but does feel really quite suboptimal versus just putting the points towards more possessed. Finally, for the characters, we've got the damned character keywords. First up, we've got the rather fun cultist command squad that is the Dark Commune. 80 points for 5 models with a few fun specialists in the unit. They're generally used to attach to accursed cultists, giving them 1 big turn of advance and charge and a +1 to hit and wound, and that does enough to make their damage go from being at least a bit incidental to genuinely quite threatening to a bunch of stuff in the game. They also get a 5+ invulnerable save, which particularly with the feel no pains makes them really quite robust, and they have a chaos icon to allow them to reroll dark pacts as well. The extra 5 bodies in the squad aren't nothing as well and add a bit more durability in themselves, and have a tiny bit of damage with the Mind Witch and the Blessed Blades. They're also quite nice for bearing enhancements for the accursed cultists, particularly in the Chaos Cult detachment where they've got multiple good ones. Outside of Chaos Cult though, they're going to stop the accursed cultists from scouting, and that could mean that they won't be able to push up quite as freely. I still think that broadly speaking they're probably worth it if accursed cultists are on the board, and just with the high points cost of accursed cultists and these guys, the overall unit does tend to cost quite a lot, so you're paying quite a premium to have one objective all gummed up with reactive move accursed cultists that are more durable and more dangerous than normal. Overall, I've given them a 7.5 out of 10 here, usable enough with Accursed Cultist and a very central unit in the Chaos Cult. Next up, we've got the Cultist Firebrand, 45 points, and another Damned Infantry character unit. He's a fairly cheap and straightforward character, d6+3 heavy flamer attacks, re-rolling leadership test for the lead unit, which can help with the Dark Pacts. He can hand out a battle shock test with the flamer, which occasionally matters for stratagems, though usually doesn't, and I guess could be a cheap leader to bear enhancements for Chaos Cult, though I feel like they work better on Accursed Cultists and Dark Communes. Overall, I just don't really think that he's got a particularly good unit that is really worth leading that much. The standard cultist mobs don't really want leaders, as they're nice and cheap and expendable. His damage output isn't really all that exciting, and doesn't pair with other units that have good shooting. The Dark Commune's better for the Accursed Cultist, and it's not really even particularly great for a minimum investment lone unit, just going off all by himself when he can field cultist mobs for just 50 points, so 5 points more than him. He's not really the biggest investment unit in the world, but it just doesn't really seem like he's got a particular place to be strong at the moment. I've given him a 3 out of 10 here. Finally, we've got the Traitor Enforcer. He's the sort of heretic commissar type figure along with his Chaos Ogrin. 65 points, and he can only lead Traitor Guardsmen. Between the pair of them, they have 8 attacks with sort of midish strength and damage too, and that's not awful damage output for a character. He gives his unit 0 CP Overwatch, leadership 6+, and brings at least a fair few wounds to the unit given the Ogrin. For the overall combined unit though, for 135 points with the Traitor Guardsmen, they just don't really value those buffs all that much. The Traitor Guardsmen aren't enormous in terms of damage and defense in their own right. The free Overwatch isn't nothing, but also they don't have the biggest damage output, so they're still not exactly likely to do loads. And then it sort of creates a unit that's neither particularly strong at range nor at melee, and might encourage your cheap objective scorers to be charging into melee where they're not really all that great. As a result, I've not really seen any people use them, even in Chaos Cult. Again, for leaders and enhancements there, it generally tends to be Accursed Cultists with Dark Communes, and better off using other Cultist units for sort of cheap, low investment, expendable chaff style units. Certainly fun models, but not really all that strong in game at the moment. I've given them a 3 out of 10 here. Just feels like other things will broadly do a fair bit better than them for the same cost. With the character units talked about though, that just about brings us to the end of this one. Let me know your thoughts as to the Codex Chaos Space Marine units and how they stack up down in the comments below. Finally, I'll just round up by quickly cycling back to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. As mentioned, one way to get a full board of Warhammer 40k terrain on the go very quickly, with their rather different pop-up folding cardboard system. As mentioned, I feel like this one does have some pros and cons versus other terrain sets that do things a bit more normally. The fact that everything's made of cardboard and folds flat does mean that it's really easy to store and transport. It can fit in the box the same size as a normal sized board game, which is pretty big for being able to store it if you don't have loads of space. It's naturally far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, though I guess you could say that of a lot of terrain alternatives out there, and it's fairly comparable to MDF. As another advantage is that it doesn't need any painting assembly or hobby time, ready to go immediately from when you get it, which could be helpful for people who want to dedicate most of their hobby time towards their armies. For disadvantages, perhaps it's a little bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF, given it is made of cardboard and it's designed to fold flat, so that does come with some compromises. It might need just a touch more care taken of it compared with other sets. The grid layout system that they have has a bit less flexibility than some. You can get some variety by rotating tiles, but it can create some fire lanes for Warhammer 40k. Might not be the worst just to have maybe 1 or 2 extra little bits to break up those firing lanes if you are playing with it. And of course it doesn't really make tournament approved layouts as well if that's what you're looking for. I feel like there's enough here to make it a good easy to transport system for casual games though. For specific sets they've got on offer, they've got a rather glowing Chaos Foundry, this one called the Forgotten Furnace with a whole bunch of glowing runes and burnt out factories. There's a more standard Destroyed City one with the Shattered Hive, a bunch of burnt out ruins and armoured containers and things. And then some more verdant ruins in an overgrown capital, maybe could be appropriate for either fantasy or 40k. Each of those also have the expansion option of a great big building as well, this one coming separately, and you make one big building by putting 2 tiles together to make a centrepiece, a cathedral type thing for 2 of them, and the Infernal Spire for the Foundry. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. In any case, I'll leave this one there for now. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts on the Chaos Space Marine units, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.